Sometimes power doesn't come from the loudest voice in the room or the most expensive suit. Sometimes it comes from knowing exactly when to speak, and when to let others reveal themselves. In the gleaming towers of corporate America, one man thought his title gave him immunity from consequence. But when he dismissed a Latina consultant with barely concealed contempt, he had no idea that her silence wasn't submission, it was strategy. What happened next sent shockwaves through the entire company and proved that underestimating the quiet ones is always a mistake. Stay with us to see how a single moment of arrogance became the most expensive lesson of his career. Before we begin, where are you watching from today? Let us know in the comments below. If you love stories of justice, resilience, and unexpected victories, make sure to hit that like button, share this video, and subscribe for more incredible tales. Your support helps us bring these powerful stories to even more people. Now, let's dive in. The morning sun cast long shadows across the polished marble floors of Nexus Technologies' 42nd floor. Through floor-to-ceiling windows, Manhattan stretched endlessly, a concrete jungle where deals worth millions were made and broken with the stroke of a pen. The executive conference room, known internally as the boardroom, sat at the heart of it all, its glass walls offering a panoramic view that reminded everyone inside exactly how high the stakes were. At precisely 9 a.m., Richard Wells strode into the conference room like a man who owned the world. At 53, Richard had spent 2 decades climbing Nexus Technologies' corporate ladder, collecting titles and territory with the methodical precision of a chess grandmaster. Senior Director of Strategic Operations was just his latest conquest, a position that came with a corner office, a 6-figure salary, and, most importantly to Richard, the authority to make or break careers with a simple recommendation. Richard's appearance was as calculated as his ambition. His charcoal gray suit was tailored to perfection, his silver hair styled with just enough product to suggest sophistication without appearing vain. His steel blue eyes held the cold efficiency of a man who had learned that sentiment was a luxury he couldn't afford. To Richard, the corporate world was a battlefield, and he had no intention of losing. "Sarah," Richard called out to his assistant, a nervous young woman who perpetually looked like she was one mistake away from unemployment. "Tell me again why we're wasting a morning on this consultant." Sarah Chen, no relation to the company's mysterious CEO, adjusted her glasses nervously as she pulled up the meeting agenda on her tablet. "The quarterly strategy review, sir. Maya Rodriguez from Martinez Strategic Consulting. She's here to present the digital transformation roadmap that was commissioned by." Sarah paused, checking her notes. "By executive order." Richard's jaw tightened slightly. Executive order meant the instruction had come from the very top, from Alexander Chen himself, Nexus Technologies' famously reclusive CEO. Richard had been with the company for over 15 years, yet he could count on one hand the number of times he'd actually seen Chen in person. The man was like a ghost, appearing only for the most critical board meetings before vanishing back into whatever ivory tower he inhabited. "Another outside consultant," Richard muttered under his breath, settling into his chair at the head of the conference table. "As if we don't have enough expertise in-house." The truth was, Richard resented consultants on principle. In his mind, they were parasites, expensive outsiders who swooped in, diagnosed problems that didn't exist, and collected hefty fees for solutions that any competent executive could have developed internally. Worse, they often had direct access to senior leadership, bypassing the careful hierarchy that Richard had spent years navigating. Sarah glanced at the door nervously. "She should be here any moment, sir. Her presentation is scheduled for 2 hours. 2 hours, Richard repeated with disdain. "That's already too long. I'll give her 30 minutes to impress me, then we're moving on to actual work." Through the glass walls, Richard could see the morning bustle of Nexus Technologies in full swing. Employees hurried between meetings, their faces focused and determined. This was Richard's domain, a world where he commanded respect, where his word carried weight, where his approval could launch careers and his disapproval could end them. At 9:15 a.m., the conference room door opened, and Maya Rodriguez entered with the quiet confidence of someone who had earned her place at every table she'd ever sat at. Maya was 34, with dark hair pulled back in a professional bun and intelligent brown eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. Her outfit, a tailored navy blazer over a white blouse, was understated but impeccably chosen, projecting competence without ostentation. Behind Maya walked her assistant, Elena Vasquez, a sharp young woman who carried Maya's presentation materials with the careful precision of someone who understood that details mattered. Elena had worked with Maya for 3 years and had seen her boss navigate hostile boardrooms, skeptical executives, and outright discrimination with the same unflappable grace. "Good morning," Maya said, offering a warm but professional smile as she approached the conference table. "I'm Maya Rodriguez from Martinez Strategic Consulting. Thank you for making time for this presentation." Richard didn't stand. He didn't even look up from his phone immediately, letting the silence stretch just long enough to establish the power dynamic he preferred. When he finally acknowledged Maya's presence, his expression was one of barely concealed impatience. "Ms. Rodriguez," Richard said, his tone flat and dismissive. "I hope you understand that my time is extremely valuable. I've allocated 30 minutes for your presentation. I trust that will be sufficient." Maya's smile didn't waver, though Elena noticed the slight tightening around her boss's eyes, a tell she recognized from years of working together. Maya had faced this kind of reception before, the thinly veiled hostility that powerful men often directed at women who dared to enter their space with expertise and confidence. "I believe the agenda called for a 2-hour session," Maya replied evenly, settling her materials on the conference table with practiced ease. "Given the scope of the digital transformation strategy we'll be discussing, I think you'll find that time frame more appropriate." Richard's eyebrows rose slightly, clearly unaccustomed to being corrected by anyone, let alone an outside consultant. "Ms. Rodriguez, I think you may have misunderstood something about how things work here. I determine how long these meetings run, not you." Elena bristled at Richard's tone, but Maya remained perfectly calm. She had encountered dozens of Richard Wells in her career, men who used their positions like weapons, who confused authority with intelligence, who believed that being loud and aggressive was the same as being right. "Of course," Maya said smoothly. "I simply want to ensure we cover all the strategic imperatives that Mr. Chen's office outlined in their brief. But we can certainly adapt to whatever time frame works best for you." The mention of Chen's name caused Richard's expression to shift slightly. Despite his bluster, he wasn't foolish enough to openly contradict a direct mandate from the CEO. Still, his resentment was palpable, radiating from him like heat from a furnace. "Fine," Richard said curtly. "Let's get started then. But I want to see value immediately, or we're cutting this short." Maya nodded graciously and moved to the front of the room, where a large display screen waited for her presentation. As she connected her laptop and began pulling up her materials, Richard leaned back in his chair with the air of a judge prepared to render a harsh verdict. "Elena," Maya said softly to her assistant, "could you pull up the executive summary slide?" Elena nodded and began working with the presentation remote, but Richard's voice cut through the room like a blade. "Actually," Richard said, his tone sharp with authority, "I prefer if only the principals handle the presentation. Your assistant can wait outside." The request was both unnecessary and deliberately insulting, a power play designed to establish dominance and isolate Maya from her support system. Elena's face flushed with anger, but Maya simply placed a gentle hand on her assistant's arm. "Elena, would you mind waiting in the reception area? I'll call you if I need anything." Elena hesitated, clearly reluctant to leave Maya alone with someone who was already demonstrating open hostility. But Maya's expression was calm and reassuring, so Elena gathered her things and headed for the door. "I'll be right outside if you need me," Elena said, shooting Richard a look that could have melted steel. Once Elena was gone, Richard's demeanor shifted subtly, becoming even more condescending now that he had Maya isolated. In his mind, he had already won this encounter. Maya was alone in his territory, subject to his rules, dependent on his approval. What Richard didn't know, what he couldn't have known, was that Maya Rodriguez had been playing this game far longer than he realized, and she had never lost. Maya began her presentation with the polished professionalism that had made her one of the most sought-after strategic consultants in the industry. Her slides were crisp and comprehensive, her analysis sharp and insightful, her recommendations backed by data that was both compelling and actionable. The digital transformation landscape has shifted dramatically in the past 18 months, Maya explained, gesturing toward a series of charts that showed market trends and competitive positioning. Companies that fail to adapt are losing market share at an unprecedented rate. Richard sat with his arms crossed, his expression one of studied boredom. He occasionally glanced at his phone, a gesture calculated to signal his disinterest. But despite his attempts to appear disengaged, Maya's presentation was actually quite impressive, more impressive than he was comfortable admitting. "These are interesting theories," Richard interrupted after Maya had been speaking for about 10 minutes. "But I'm curious about your actual experience implementing these strategies. How many Fortune 500 companies have you actually worked with?" The question was clearly designed to undermine Maya's credibility, implying that she was all theory and no practice. But Maya had anticipated this line of attack. "Over the past 5 years, I've led digital transformation initiatives for 12 Fortune 500 companies," Maya replied calmly. "Including 2 that are directly competitive with Nexus Technologies. I'd be happy to provide case studies, though I'm sure you understand that client confidentiality prevents me from naming them specifically." Richard's eyes narrowed. Maya's response was both confident and appropriately professional, but it hadn't given him the opening he was looking for. He tried a different approach. "And I suppose these other companies just handed you multi-million-dollar contracts based on your credentials?" Richard's pause before the word credentials was deliberate, implying that Maya's qualifications were somehow suspect. Maya's smile remained steady, though Elena would have recognized the slight tightening of her jaw, a sign that Maya was beginning to lose patience with Richard's transparent attempts at intimidation. "My credentials speak for themselves," Maya said evenly. "MIT for my undergraduate degree, Harvard Business School for my MBA, followed by 8 years at McKinsey & Company before I founded my own firm. But I understand that you'd prefer to focus on the substance of my recommendations rather than my background." Richard felt a flicker of irritation. Maya's credentials were actually quite impressive, more impressive than his own, if he was being honest. But admitting that would undermine the narrative he was trying to construct. "Experience trumps education," Richard said dismissively. "Anyone can get a fancy degree. It's what you do in the real world that matters." Maya nodded thoughtfully. "I couldn't agree more. Which is why I'm sure you'll appreciate that my recommendations are based on real-world implementation, not theoretical frameworks." She advanced to the next slide, which showed a detailed project timeline with specific milestones and deliverables. Richard studied it for a moment, looking for flaws he could exploit. "This timeline seems aggressive," Richard said finally. "Are you sure you understand the complexity of our organization? We're not some startup that can pivot on a dime." "I've factored in the organizational complexity," Maya replied. "In fact, companies of Nexus Technologies' size and scope often move faster than smaller organizations because they have more resources to dedicate to transformation initiatives." Richard leaned forward, his voice taking on a more aggressive tone. "Ms. Rodriguez, I've been with this company for over 15 years. I know how things work here. I know our culture, our processes, our people. With all due respect, you've been here for 15 minutes. Maya met his gaze directly, her voice remaining perfectly calm. "You're absolutely right about your institutional knowledge being valuable. That's why successful transformation requires both external perspective and internal expertise working together." Richard's frustration was beginning to show. Maya wasn't taking the bait, wasn't getting defensive, wasn't giving him the opening he needed to dismiss her entirely. Instead, she was responding to his attacks with professional grace, making him look petty and small by comparison. "Look," Richard said, his voice getting louder, "I don't know who you impressed to get this meeting, but I can tell you right now that this isn't going to work. We have real priorities here, real deadlines, real responsibilities. We don't have time for consultants to come in and reinvent the wheel. Maya paused her presentation and turned to face Richard directly. For the first time since entering the room, her expression shifted slightly, not to anger or defensiveness, but to something that looked almost like pity. "Mr. Wells," Maya said quietly, "I think there may be some confusion about why I'm here." Richard's face flushed red. "There's no confusion. You're here because someone upstairs thinks we need an outside opinion. But I'm here to tell you that your opinion isn't needed or wanted." Maya looked at Richard for a long moment, as if she was trying to decide something. Then she smiled, a small, knowing smile that somehow made Richard feel very, very uneasy. "I see," Maya said softly. "Well, perhaps we should call Mr. Chen and clarify the purpose of this meeting." Richard's bluster faltered slightly. "Mr. Chen is a very busy man. I don't think we need to bother him with the details of a consultant presentation." "Oh, I don't think it would be a bother," Maya said, her smile widening slightly. "In fact, I'm quite sure he'd want to know how this meeting is going." Something in Maya's tone made Richard pause. There was a confidence there that went beyond professional competence, a certainty that suggested Maya knew something he didn't. "Are you threatening me?" Richard asked, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. Maya laughed, a genuine, musical sound that filled the conference room. "Mr. Wells, I would never threaten anyone. I'm simply suggesting that we make sure everyone is on the same page about the objectives for this meeting." Richard stared at Maya, trying to read her expression. There was something happening here that he didn't understand, some dynamic that was slipping beyond his control. For the first time since Maya had entered the room, Richard felt a flicker of uncertainty. But his pride wouldn't let him back down now. He had gone too far to retreat without losing face entirely. "Fine," Richard said, standing up abruptly. "I've heard enough. This meeting is over. Sarah will show you out." Maya didn't move from her position at the front of the room. She simply looked at Richard with that same small, knowing smile. "Are you sure that's what you want to do?" Maya asked quietly. Richard felt his anger flare again. "I don't know who you think you are, but you don't get to question my decisions in my conference room." Maya nodded slowly, as if she had been expecting this exact response. "Of course. Your conference room, your decision. But before I go, perhaps I should mention that I have another meeting scheduled here in about 10 minutes. Richard frowned. "Another meeting? With who?" Maya's smile grew slightly wider. "With Alexander Chen." The name hit Richard like a physical blow. Alexander Chen didn't take meetings with consultants. He barely took meetings with his own senior staff. The idea that Maya had a follow-up meeting with the CEO himself was impossible. "That's ridiculous," Richard said, but his voice lacked its earlier conviction. "Mr. Chen doesn't." Maya pulled out her phone and scrolled through her calendar. "Would you like me to call his office and confirm? I have Elena's direct number." Richard stared at Maya, his mind racing. Elena, Maya had mentioned Elena. But Richard's assistant was named Sarah. Who was Elena? "Who," Richard asked slowly, "is Elena?" Maya's smile became genuinely warm for the first time since entering the room. "Elena Chen. Alexander's daughter. She's been working as my assistant for the past 6 months as part of her MBA internship." The conference room fell completely silent. Richard felt the blood drain from his face as the implications of Maya's words sank in. Elena, the young woman he had just dismissed from the room like a servant, was the CEO's daughter. But if Elena was Alexander Chen's daughter, then Maya wasn't just some random consultant. She was someone with direct access to the CEO's family, someone trusted enough to mentor his daughter. Richard's mouth opened and closed uselessly as he tried to process what this meant. He had just spent 30 minutes openly disrespecting someone who clearly had the CEO's confidence and protection. "I think," Maya said gently, "that we should wait for Mr. Chen to arrive before we make any final decisions about this presentation." Richard sank back into his chair, his earlier arrogance completely evaporated. Outside the conference room's glass walls, he could see employees going about their daily business, unaware that their senior director of strategic operations had just made what might be the biggest mistake of his career. Maya returned to her presentation materials with the same calm professionalism she had shown throughout the entire encounter. But now Richard saw her composure in a completely different light. It wasn't the desperate calm of someone trying to survive a hostile environment, it was the serene confidence of someone who knew she held all the cards. "Mr. Wells," Maya said without looking up from her laptop, "would you like me to continue with the presentation while we wait? I think you'll find the implementation timeline quite interesting." Richard could only nod weakly, his mind reeling with the realization that he had just declared war on someone who had direct access to the one person who could end his career with a single phone call. Maya smiled and advanced to the next slide, completely unruffled by the chaos she had just unleashed in Richard's world. The next 10 minutes passed in excruciating silence for Richard Wells. Maya continued her presentation with unflappable professionalism, but Richard barely heard a word. His mind was spinning with damage control scenarios, each one more desperate than the last. Maybe Elena hadn't mentioned the meeting to her father. Maybe Maya was exaggerating her relationship with the Chin family. Maybe there was still a way to salvage this situation before it destroyed everything he had worked to build. Richard's phone buzzed with a text message. He glanced down and felt his stomach drop. "Sarah Chen, Mr. Chen's office confirms his 10 a.m. meeting with Ms. Rodriguez. He'll be arriving momentarily. Sarah." His assistant Sarah Chen. Suddenly the name connection clicked in his mind with horrifying clarity. Sarah wasn't just any employee, she was also part of the Chen family network. How had he never made that connection before? Richard looked up to find Maya watching him with an expression that might have been sympathy if not for the slight amusement in her eyes. "Is everything all right, Mr. Wells?" Maya asked politely. "You look a bit pale." Richard forced a smile that felt like breaking glass. "I'm fine. Just processing the information." Maya nodded understanding. It can be a lot to take in. Digital transformation affects every aspect of an organization's operations. But Richard wasn't thinking about digital transformation anymore. He was thinking about survival. "Ms. Rodriguez," Richard said, his voice carefully modulated, "I think perhaps we got off on the wrong foot. I may have been a bit direct in my feedback." Maya tilted her head slightly, as if considering his words. Direct feedback is always valuable. It helps ensure that everyone's expectations are aligned. Richard felt a flicker of hope. Maybe Maya was giving him an opening to walk back his earlier hostility. Maybe she understood that successful business relationships required some flexibility and forgiveness. "Exactly," Richard said, warming to this new approach. "And I want you to know that I absolutely appreciate the thoroughness of your research. The presentation is quite comprehensive." "Thank you," Maya replied graciously. "I believe in being prepared." Richard leaned forward, trying to project collaborative enthusiasm. "And that timeline you showed, very ambitious, but I can see how it might work with the right support structure." Maya nodded. Implementation is always the critical factor. Having leadership buy-in makes all the difference. "Absolutely. And you can count on my full support moving forward. In fact, I'd like to personally oversee the integration with our existing operational framework." Maya's expression remained pleasant, but something shifted in her eyes, a sharpening that Richard might have recognized if he had been paying closer attention. "That's very generous of you," Maya said carefully. "Though I should mention that the oversight structure has already been established through Mr. Chen's office." Richard's smile faltered slightly. "Of course. I just meant that I'd like to be involved in whatever capacity would be most helpful." "I'm sure we can find an appropriate role for everyone," Maya replied diplomatically. The conference room door opened, and Sarah Chen entered with a nervous expression. "Mr. Wells," Sarah said, her voice tight with anxiety, "Mr. Chen is here for his meeting with Ms. Rodriguez." Richard's carefully constructed composure cracked slightly. Already? He's just finishing up a call, Sarah continued. He asked me to let you know he'll be joining you in just a moment. Richard nodded jerkily. Of course. Thank you, Sarah. As Sarah left, Richard turned back to Maya with what he hoped was a confident smile. I'm looking forward to meeting with Mr. Chen. It's been far too long since we've had a chance to connect directly. Maya's smile became genuinely warm for the first time since the meeting began. I'm sure he'll be pleased to hear about your enthusiasm for the project. Richard felt a chill run down his spine. There was something in Maya's tone that suggested she was looking forward to that conversation for reasons that might not align with his own interests. Ms. Rodriguez, Richard said, lowering his voice conspiratorially, I hope you understand that sometimes in high-pressure business environments, communication can become more intense than intended. I wouldn't want any misunderstandings about my commitment to this initiative. Maya studied Richard's face for a long moment. Mr. Wells, are you asking me not to mention your earlier feedback to Mr. Chen? Richard's face flushed. I'm simply suggesting that we focus on moving forward productively rather than dwelling on any initial calibration issues. I see, Maya said softly. And what would you consider productive moving forward? Richard saw his chance and leaned into it. Full collaboration. Open communication. Whatever resources you need to make this transformation successful. Maya nodded thoughtfully. And if I were to need significant budget approval? Executive mandate? Direct access to department heads? Whatever you need, Richard said quickly. You have my complete support. Maya's smile returned, but now it carried an edge that made Richard deeply uncomfortable. That's very accommodating of you. I'll be sure to mention your cooperative spirit to Mr. Chen. Before Richard could respond, the conference room door opened again, and Alexander Chen entered. Alexander Chen was not what most people expected from a tech company CEO. At 62, he projected quiet authority rather than flashy charisma. His appearance was understated, a simple dark suit, minimal jewelry, gray hair styled conservatively. But his presence filled the room immediately, commanding attention without demanding it. Maya, Alexander said warmly, crossing to shake her hand. I hope the presentation has been going well. Very illuminating, Maya replied, shooting a quick glance at Richard. Mr. Wells has been quite engaged with the material. Alexander turned to Richard with a polite smile. Richard. I don't think we've spoken directly since the quarterly reviews. How are things in strategic operations? Richard stood quickly, nearly knocking over his chair in his haste. Mr. Chen. Excellent to see you. Things are going very well. Very well indeed. And I have to say, Ms. Rodriguez's presentation has been absolutely exceptional. Alexander's eyebrows rose slightly. Has it? I'm glad to hear that. Maya's work tends to be quite thorough. Oh, extremely thorough, Richard gushed. The level of detail, the strategic thinking, really top-notch. I was just telling Ms. Rodriguez that she can count on my full support for implementation. Alexander looked between Richard and Maya, his expression thoughtful. That's wonderful to hear. Maya, how would you characterize the reception your recommendations have received? Maya paused, seeming to consider her words carefully. Richard held his breath. It's been very educational, Maya said finally. I think everyone has learned something important about expectations and communication. Alexander nodded. Learning is always valuable. Richard, do you have any specific questions about the strategic framework? Richard felt like he was walking through a minefield. Actually, I think Ms. Rodriguez has covered everything quite comprehensively. I'm ready to move forward whenever you give the word. Excellent, Alexander said. Because I'd like to discuss implementation timelines. Maya, would you mind walking us through the next phases? Maya returned to her presentation, but now Richard saw everything differently. This wasn't just a consultant giving a standard pitch, this was someone with direct access to the CEO, someone whose recommendations would carry enormous weight in the organization's future direction. As Maya spoke about budgets, personnel allocation, and departmental restructuring, Richard realized that his earlier hostility hadn't just been unprofessional, it had been strategically catastrophic. He had positioned himself as an obstacle to an initiative that clearly had CEO-level priority. The implementation will require significant change management, Maya was explaining. Some resistance is natural, but leadership support will be critical to overcome it. Alexander nodded. And do you foresee any specific challenges with getting that leadership support? Maya glanced at Richard, her expression unreadable. I think most leaders will recognize the strategic value once they understand the full scope of the transformation. Most leaders. Alexander pressed gently. Richard felt sweat beading on his forehead. This was his moment to demonstrate his value, to show that he could be a trusted partner in the transformation rather than an impediment. Absolutely no challenges from my end, Richard interjected quickly. I'm fully committed to making this succeed. Alexander studied Richard's face for a moment that felt like an eternity. Then he smiled. I'm very glad to hear that, Richard. Because Maya's recommendations will require some significant organizational changes, particularly in strategic operations. Richard's smile froze. Organizational changes? Nothing dramatic, Alexander said casually. But the digital transformation will require a different skill set and approach. Maya will be working directly with HR to identify the competencies we'll need going forward. Richard felt the room spinning slightly. Working with HR. Maya spoke up, her voice professionally neutral. Part of any transformation involves ensuring that leadership capabilities align with strategic objectives. It's standard practice. Richard looked between Maya and Alexander, suddenly understanding that this meeting had never been about getting his approval for Maya's recommendations. It had been about evaluating whether he was capable of adapting to the changes that were already in motion. And based on his performance over the past hour, that evaluation was not going in his favor. Of course, Richard said weakly. Whatever's best for the organization. Alexander checked his watch. Maya, do you have everything you need to move forward with the next phase? I believe so, Maya replied. Though I may need to schedule some follow-up conversations with key stakeholders. Alexander nodded. Richard, you'll make yourself available for those discussions? Absolutely, Richard said, though his voice lacked conviction. Alexander shook hands with both Maya and Richard. Excellent. I look forward to seeing the results. As Alexander left the conference room, Richard and Maya were left alone once again. The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken understanding. Ms. Rodriguez, Richard said finally, his voice barely above a whisper, I think I may have misunderstood the scope of this initiative. Maya began packing up her presentation materials with the same methodical precision she had shown throughout the entire encounter. Transformation is always challenging, Maya said without looking up. But it's necessary for organizations that want to remain competitive. Richard watched her pack, knowing that he was witnessing the methodical dismantling of his career. Is there anything I can do to? Richard trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. Maya looked up at him then, her expression neither cruel nor kind, simply businesslike. Mr. Wells, Maya said quietly, the transformation has already begun. The only question now is whether people choose to adapt or resist. Richard stared at her, finally understanding that this had never been a battle he could win. Maya hadn't defeated him through superior tactics or political maneuvering. She had simply allowed him to defeat himself. As Maya walked toward the conference room door, Richard made one final, desperate attempt to salvage something from the wreckage. Ms. Rodriguez, Richard called out. About Elena, I didn't know she was. Maya turned back, her hand on the door handle. Elena learned a great deal from observing this meeting. I think it will be very valuable for her professional development. The door closed behind Maya with a soft click, leaving Richard alone in the conference room that no longer felt like his domain. Through the glass walls, he could see the normal business of Nexus Technologies continuing around him. But Richard knew that for him, nothing would ever be normal again. He had underestimated Maya Rodriguez, and that mistake was going to cost him everything he had spent 15 years building. But Maya's work at Nexus Technologies was just beginning. 3 months later, the transformation of Nexus Technologies was complete in ways that went far beyond digital systems and processes. The company had restructured its entire leadership approach, prioritizing collaborative expertise over hierarchical authority. Richard Wells had been offered a generous severance package and had decided to pursue other opportunities. His replacement was a forward-thinking executive who understood that the future belonged to leaders who could build bridges rather than walls. Maya Rodriguez's consulting firm had been retained for a 3-year partnership, with Elena Chen transitioning from intern to full-time associate after completing her MBA. The mentorship had proved valuable for both women, Elena gaining real-world strategic experience, and Maya gaining deeper insight into the Chen family's vision for sustainable corporate leadership. Alexander Chen had used the successful transformation as a case study for other companies in his investment portfolio, demonstrating that sustainable change required both strategic vision and cultural evolution. The conference room where Maya had faced Richard's hostility was eventually renamed the Collaboration Center, serving as a reminder that the strongest organizations were built through inclusive leadership rather than intimidation. Maya often reflected on that morning when she gave talks at business schools and leadership conferences. Her message was always the same: true power came not from demanding respect, but from earning it through competence, patience, and the wisdom to let others reveal their character through their own choices. Sometimes, Maya would tell her audiences, the most powerful thing you can do is remain calm while others lose control. Because in the end, character always reveals itself, and integrity always wins. The story of that morning became legendary within Nexus Technologies, not as a tale of corporate warfare, but as an example of how quiet strength could transform an entire organization's culture. And whenever new employees heard the story, they learned the most important lesson of all: never underestimate the power of someone who chooses patience over anger, strategy over emotion, and grace over revenge. Because in the corporate world, as in life, those who underestimate the quiet ones always learn their lesson too late. If this story resonated with you, we'd love to hear about your own experiences with workplace dynamics and transformation. Have you ever witnessed someone's character reveal itself under pressure? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to like this video if you enjoyed Maya's journey, and subscribe to the 8th Battery for more tales of justice, resilience, and the power of quiet strength. Your support helps us continue sharing these meaningful stories. What did you think of Richard's downfall? Was justice served? Let us know in the comments, and we'll see you in the next story.